tonight we had planned for 8 p.m. the fireside chat with Joe Kamenkow. That will be at 1 o'clock today in this room. 1 o'clock today. And Joe has got a mountain of goodies. Make sure you're here for that. Also, call it the unlucky 13th year, although we're in our 14th year. We've had a couple of people that have not been able to make it this year. One of them being Wayne Nyans. He had a slight accident. Actually, he's in the cast right now, but he's in good spirits and good shape and should be with us next year. Also, I'm sorry to say that Christian Marshall not able to attend from France. So that's a disappointment to me, but we'll work on that again for next year. As a reminder, the autograph session is at 3:30 on Saturday. The flip-out preliminaries will end this year at 5 p.m. instead of about 5:30. And I need a show of hands on the banquets as far as those that want fish dinners. 1, 2. Any vegetarians?
What's the other choice?
Meat.
Cheeseburgers.
Once again, at the banquet, we have the Make-A-Wish Foundation. We're having an auction there. And we ask for anyone that cares to give any donations towards it. It would be great. I talked to Masai Horiguchi, and he is donating a copy of his book at the auction, and there'll be a lot more. I also understand from Pat Waller that Williams is bringing a lot of items to the charity auction, so it should be really good. In your handout, there should be the badge, the survey, the banquet, and flip-out tickets, and also the website list that Dave Marston made. So make sure you have that. Without further ado, I'd like to hand this mic over to my assistant and #1 exhibits man, Mike Pasek.
I'd just like to welcome all you guys. When we did this 14 years ago, we didn't know it would last more than 1 year, and it's 14 years later. I kind of look at this every year as a kind of family reunion, with the family getting bigger every year. A couple things we'd like to thank some people for. We'd like to thank Sega for their help in the tournament situation. You know, it's a tough industry out there now, and getting them to let us use 10 games and their people, you get a chance to thank them for that. The flip-out grand prize, as you probably all know, is the Starship Troopers. Just wants to take a look in there. Next thing I know, he's found something he wants. So my mistake has always been to say, okay, we'll make a deal on when I look at the game. When typically, normally, he always gets the choices of choice games, and I only find out after it's sent in his basement. So no more of those deals. Anyways, I'm proud to introduce today probably one of the foremost woodrug collectors and fast becoming a true authority on this field, Richard Launders. Richard?
Thank you, Mike and Rob. And I'd really like to thank both of them for giving me this opportunity to share some of the things that I have collected over the years with everybody out here. People who I think really appreciate what collectors go through and what we do to make games working and cosmetically presentable. As an introduction to this tape that I made up with Don Murphy, I'd like to say I'm 54 years old, bought my first game 25 years ago. And how did that happen? A fellow policeman walked into my store, it's a retail clothing store, said, I need a suit for a funeral. We just confiscated a slot machine and a pinball machine. Can you take one for a suit? I'm real dumb. I took the pinball machine. But anyway, it was a Melody, 67 Melody, and I still have it in my basement today. I have 2 daughters. They played it as they grew up. Their boyfriends played it. And I always loved anything with a ball, and it sort of hooked me. But I never really got into the hobby in an extravagant way until I met Rob a little later on. Rob was always a friend of my wife's brother, so a friend of the family. But Rob, I had heard, had a bunch of these machines, and one day I went over and looked, and he had a ton of them. And I knew where there was a old Chicago, but it had broken backlash. I said to Rob, do you know where I can get a backlash for this? He said, call Steve Engel, Maker. So I called, this was in the mid-'80s. So I called Steve Engel, and I said, do you have a backlash for this? He said, I'll check. Came back and said, no, I don't, but I'll put you on my want list. This was mid-'80s. About 9 months later, there's a phone call. I found a backlash for you. I said, wait a second, let me go see if the game's still there. game was still there, the guy said I could have it for nothing, so I took it. And that sort of led the progression. The wood rail thing never really came on until the early 90s. And it goes to show you can accumulate a lot of equipment quickly. It's the type of equipment I found after making several mistakes, I think we all do, that you really want, that becomes a passion with you after you go through different types of games. As far as how do you find these games, I've had incredible luck in finding these games. And it's just like in business, the harder you work, the luckier you get. I'll give you one instance. Back in 92 or 93, I was trying to figure out how in the world I find wood rail pinball games in Northeast Ohio with Rob Burke and Mike Pasak. So we have 1,000 games, 4,000 games, and everything is just sucked dry. So I had a bunch of reading material, and one of the things I had was Pinball Collector's Quarterly, which was put out by Gordon Passy and Steve Young back in the early 80s. This one is winter of 1982. And there were 4 of these. And for what reason they quit, I have no idea, but it was a great magazine. And I had just gotten these in the mail, and I started looking through them, and there were some want ads in the back. So I went down the list of the want ads. This is 12 years later. Made a list of the people and sent off letters. And you think, well, most of the people are dead, some, you'll never hear from anyway. But anyway, the letter I sent off was this one. Dear Paul, I am currently buying older EM pinball games. Top dollar paid. If you have any for sale, would you please contact me? 50s and 60s games, sincerely. That was dated May 26th. On September 2nd, I get a response. On the back of my thing, on the back of the letter. Richard, I have a Gottlieb Dragonette. So that got my interest. Also have one dated November 1941. No flippers. Lots of holes. I think you just shake the damn thing. Anyway, I've forgotten the name of it and who made it. The wife has so much stuff stacked around it, I can't get to it. That sounds normal. At least not in the last few years. Also have Planter's Peanut Man, scales, about 4 feet high. Those things are worth a fortune. They made less than 100 in the 40s, perfect. Also a Coke machine, H81. Also a 12-year-old daughter. And an 8-year-old Great Dane. This guy's wacko. I'll throw in all 5 for any kind of deal. Anyway.
Like a dummy, you took the pinball.
I'm not in jail. So anyway, right away I call the guy up, get a hold of him, and he says, well, I said I was interested in the pinball game. I didn't know about the daughters, they were just a little young at that time. But anyway, he says, well, I have to speak to the wife. So this is in September. And I said, when should I call you back? He said, no, I'll call you. I said, well, I'll call you, how about a week? He says, okay, call back in a week. He said, well, at this point, I don't think we want to do anything. I said, are you interested in selling? He says, maybe in the future. Give me a call. I said, when? He says, I don't know. I said, how about a couple of months? He goes, okay. I call it, and he says, by the way, I have an 800 number at work. Great. And I'm trying to remember the dating, but maybe 3 months later, I call him up again, and I called his wife, and she said, well, you can probably get him at work. So I call work, and they go, well, he's not here. Can we take a message? And I said, no, I'm not going to tell someone I'm calling about a pinball game at work. I don't think he's doing such a hot job there. He's got his priorities a little screwed up. So I said, no, I'll call back. I call back a week later. No, he's not here right now. Can we take a message? I call back a week later. No, he's not here. Can I take a message? So at that point, I said, wait a second. Is he still working there? The girl just sits there stunned. And I've seen this happen before. I said, is he on a temporary leave of absence? She said, yeah. So I'm sure he's in some sort of rehab. Okay. So at that point, you know, the door's opening a little bit. So I call his wife, and I said, I just tried to get your husband, I can't get him. Is there any way I can get in touch with him? Is he home? She said, no, we're getting divorced. And by the way, he doesn't work there anymore. By the way, he's in rehab for alcohol. That's the trifecta. Anyone who goes to the track knows the trifecta.
Yeah.
At that point, I said to her, would you mind if you see him? Asking him, I made an offer on a game. Will he, you know, sell the game? Will he accept this offer? It was $800 or $900. She said, I'll have him call you back. I said, wait a second. I'll call you back. So I called her back a week later anyway. She said, okay, we'll do it now. We have to get rid of it. And she said, why don't you come out 3 or 4 months? This is 600 miles away. I said, you know what? I'm making a trip out there next week. I'll come out next week. I'm with you. She goes, okay. So my wife gets in the car with me, and off we go 600 miles. Get there on a Friday night, 9 o'clock, walk into this house, and there's the pinball game all lit up in the living room. Absolutely flawless dragon, beautiful. And no one was playing. In another room, I hear someone sobbing. My wife is there. But this time we were fairly friendly from all the phone calls. And I say, is everything okay? My daughter's so upset she doesn't want to sell the game. Yeah. I said to my wife, I said, let me pick her. Grab this one. Take her in another room. I'm disassembling the game. I'm leaving the money right here. We're leaving. Which is exactly what I did. I was out of there in 10 minutes. Well, anyway, I guess the moral is some things are hard to find. Once you find them, you know, in this hobby, you don't give up. Once you get a whip of something, you go after it. With the older games like this, they're becoming harder and harder to find. I used to not pick up partials. Now I think you ought to pick up partials because I'm finding people with bodies can match up heads. People with heads can match up bodies. It's very rare anymore that we're finding a perfect playfield cabinet glass. They just don't come along. It's taken me in most of these games 2 or 3 games to put together one. So I would not pick up partials. I would not pick up discard partials. I'd pick them up. I had a fellow call me who just picked up a dozen bodies the other week, all good 50s games. So I think the internet is such that you can find these games and make complete games. And that is the one thing I'd really like to see everyone do, and that is not discard this stuff. It's too valuable at this point. And with that, maybe we go to the video, Mike. What this is, Don Murphy did this video back in April, and it's wonderful. It's a little scattery in the beginning, because we really didn't know we were going to show it. But in the middle, I think it's pretty darn good.
Still set up down here.
Which one is that?
Melody, Conflict, 1967 Adderall.
Next. Okay.
So we need to change our hookup here too. Thanks, Rob. So today we're going to talk about publishing in hypertext. It's closely related to the internet because the internet is the way that most of you experience this. And I'd like to thank Dick Pulaska very much for coming all the way from Waterbury, Connecticut, and making a few technical investments to help us get this so that you can actually see it here. And
subscribe can see an example of what is available and maybe be interested in subscribing or just become interested in pinball. You know, there's a lot of people out there who are just players. There's a lot of people who are interested in the history, various facets, and I'm hoping that this will fill some of those gaps that people didn't know existed, just as I didn't know it existed before I came here.
And when he says Tim, he's referring to Tim Ferrante, publisher of Gaming Magazine. Terry, how about you? Did you aspire to produce hard copy, or what were you thinking when this Pinball World War II idea came together?
It actually started out more as I was into the web and designing a web server at the time, so it was actually more technically oriented towards creating something in HTML that was kind of neat. And I happen to have a lot of Billboard magazines for the World War II period, so I decided that would be my project. So it started out just a few HTML pages, and it kind of grew out of control idea was to put something sizable on the web and just, you know, just good information there for the heck of it for people to see. And it grew from there.
Okay, thanks. Scott, you want to point out anything about Silver Bowl News and Views?
Well, one thing being, I'm trying to emulate magazines, so basically, so it's a familiar medium for people who are new to the internet, or for those who are experts at it. It's something that you don't have to relearn. You can just do it. So I have different sections of the magazine that are devoted to a variety of topics: editorials, machine reviews, auction updates, really a lot, like a combination of game room and in-game journal, but in-game only.
And I see here, this is volume 2, number 5, so you're publishing on a regular schedule.
Every 2 months I've been publishing, a few times I was a week late, so every 2 months. And really the general quality of the magazine is dependent upon the subscribers, or not the subscribers, but the people who contribute, just as with in-game journal. If I only have a few contributions, that's pretty much all I'll put in it, aside from what I take the time to, or have the time to include myself.
Okay, is there any page here that we might want to jump to?
Really, why don't we go to the cover story, just click on Vegas.
Movies or TV shows and the like. We use the rec.games.pinball news group, also known as RGP, in casual discussion. It's a good way to keep up with those things too. A few months ago, there was an issue of Men's Health magazine that had a little item about pinball, and somebody out of the thousands of people who read RGP gets that magazine and alerted the rest of us that issue had the pinball story, and we got the word in time for those of us who were interested to go buy the magazine on the newsstand. That's worked many times in the past. And also through RGP, you get videotaping alerts that something's coming up on a certain network or cable channel. And you get advance warning so you know to tape it. So we get, as I say, that's the casual end of the scale. Somebody can quickly and easily put up a little news item and we all find out about it. Last night we talked about all the internet services. Today we're focusing on the hypertext aspect as seen through the World Wide Web, or locally here.
He's been involved with the Expo since its inception. It's because of his early publication that really got the fire going among the collectors community. He too is a collector, an enthusiast, an editor, and most recently, the kingpin of parts. I'm glad to have him come today to speak for us, and he will speak. His first topic will be on the topic that Scott Sheridan had, what should be in your toolbox. My friend Steve Young. Steve?
French fries. Down in front. He is down. Hey guys, pass me that for Nova. It's a handout from Nova. Yeah,
We're all happy to be here, and thank you for coming. Scott Sheridan had something come up in his family and asked me to fill in for him. I want to try to fill his shoes. I didn't bring the white coat. So imagine I'm in a white coat. Steve Jasinski was nice enough to bring up these flyers that Scott had printed up, and I saw them for the first time 5 minutes ago. So we'll speed read them together. I would like to make this an interactive kind of a thing, and kind of concentrate on tools. Rob, probably, I don't know if you went over the schedule for this morning, but the talk that I was going to give this afternoon will follow in the next half-hour segment, so I'll get to talk see in your toolbox, I know he was soliciting input out of Vegas. It looks like it's alphabetized, so we can go on. I'm gonna add some of my own personal comments to the listing as we kind of go along. He starts out with the beginning of the alphabet, which is A, which is Allen wrenches. Make some suggestions about having common ones, both metric and English, mostly English. While we're on Allen wrenches, I would suggest that given modern games have Torx fasteners, and Torx fasteners or security Torx fasteners tend to get in your way of unlocking back boxes, keys are lost and so forth, that you might add Torx security bits to this list of Allen wrenches. One of the most handy tools for electromechanical repair and some solid state repairs is a set of alligator clips. Work really good if you've got wire attached to it with an alligator clip on the other end. If you don't need to use both ends to hold something, you can, but being able to jumper around things and confirm, kind of dividing the problem into two halves and saying, well, is a connection lost between here and here or between there and there, really allows you to divide and conquer, figuring out what the problem is that you're trying to solve. All-in-one tool is handy if you've got limited toolbox space, or keep one in your truck, and when so-and-so says there's a filling machine for sale, you don't have your toolbox, you can still be somewhat dangerous. It's a great idea. Balls are great. I would add a scribe besides an awl, because I use awls for punching holes in wood where you want to put a screw or you want to move a switch. And balls don't necessarily do a good job of scribing steel or putting a mark on something where you would like to have it. Batteries, some AA alkalines are used throughout, solid state, and keeping a spare set on. You wouldn't believe how many times I get a phone call. My Williams game comes up and I get numbers and a space and other numbers in my number one display. What's wrong with my game? Batteries are dead. That's the number one kind of thing. Or number two, your battery's older and corroded. But a lot of people, there's a lot of new people with the advent of a lot of games hitting the market. There's a lot of people who really are just getting their feet wet, just learning about pinball for the first time, but they don't even know there's a battery in their pinball machine. So get in the habit of that. And while you're changing the smoke alarm battery in October, change your pinball battery too, so it doesn't leak. Black electrical tape, Tim Arnold believes in getting them paid for. I think he used the word Taiwan tool town, right, Tim? How did I do that? Don't use that stuff. Use some good stuff. Buffing wheel for cleaning up metal is handy. Contact spray. Very controversial topic. Doesn't belong in electromechanical games. Sometimes useful for cleaning things up. Would suggest that the greatest damage from contact spray comes from allowing it to soak into switch stacks and playfield wood, so that it really doesn't evaporate. That serves then as a wick to supply more material so that it causes damage. So if you have to use it, avoid overspray and avoid getting the material soaked into the plywood in the bottom of the game and so forth. Contact blade adjusters. When I started out, I made my own. If you buy one of different brands, it may not do the job you have. It's an 1/8-inch diameter cylinder of steel with a slot cut in it so you can bend contacts. Sometimes you have to add extra bends. Sometimes the extra bends don't buy anything. But they're a very handy tool unless you're working on the newest games where there's almost no bladed contacts anymore. Everybody's gone to micro switches. Crescent wrench, that's fairly obvious, very handy to have one, and it fills a one of the handiest. And possibly having like a 1032 and maybe an 832 and you have a drill and a couple of taps, you could be pretty dangerous fixing a stripped out coil stop right on a location. You don't need a machine shop in the back of your truck. That so many games people see where the screw stripped out. What did somebody do? They run a sheetrock screw right through the coil stop, right into the bottom of the plate field, up through the bottom of the plate field, and bend the absolute you know what out of the mounting plate and create a new post on the top side. Put a rubber ring on it, guys. When you're looking at taps and dies, there are things called rethreading taps and rethreading dies. And they don't cut metal, but they kind of reform it, and they're kind of handy to have. You might want to look at them in terms of being able to recover something. A lot of times the plate on the inside of the cabinet has got no threads left because somebody went around a million times after it kept turning. But sometimes you can salvage it. And you're stuck, it helps a lot. Digital multimeter. Luke 79 is a workhorse. Has a lot of various capacities that work on both electromechanical and solid state games. Dremel tool, one of my favorite tools to have in a toolbox. I think the most famous, my most favorite
Taking out screws as well.
tool for a Dremel is a cutoff wheel. I use it for everything. You put a slot in a broken screw and you can back it out. I use it to grind because it gives me better control over what I'm grinding. You kind of really have to go very careful at it. Buy 25 of them in a package at a time. Very, very handy tool. Drills and drill bits. Kind of self-explanatory to have one around for drilling out locks or opening up a hole. Emery boards. Scott looks like he likes to condition them before he uses them. They do shed a lot of material, and by removing a lot of that extra material, you don't leave grid inside switch contacts, or you can buy Flexstone files if you get the good ones. There are some import Flexstones that have a similar problem where a lot of the material just slides right off the substrate. You don't end up with much of a file and you end up with a lot of garbage inside. Not great for working on hard contacts, which are used in flipper buttons and endostrokes and newer games. You really can't remove material. It's not hard enough. It just damages the file instead of damaging the metal, which is what you're trying to do. Extension cord. I keep a cord that allows you to plug 2 or 3 things in, usually with a cheater on it, so you can run it around it, whatever. And last year, I brought a slideshow to Expo that talked about our move to a new building to accommodate our expansion and to accommodate the parts that were coming in from Gotham. And the story really wasn't finished. It's continued to evolve. And when Bob asked me what I wanted to talk about, I said I'd like to talk about the continuation of that story. It's interesting, and there's things that were occurring that we really couldn't talk about then, and there's things that have unfolded that I wouldn't have predicted could have unfolded. So I'm back to, without the slides, to kind of tell you a story about what's come about and what we're going to continue to do. So this is the rest of the story. We have to go back a little over 2 years to when Gottlieb closed the doors.
By the way, as a reminder, 1 o'clock is the Joe Kamikow talk here in this room here. Okay, hi, I'm Tim. I've had my life's goal as visitor with to accumulate one of every Gottlieb game ever made. Right now I have one of every Gottlieb game between 1947 and 1986, except two. If you can help me out, I'm looking for a double feature and a Kubert's Quest. And then between 86 and the end in 96, I'm only missing 12 games. I'm looking real hard for Excalibur, Arena, Bone Busters, Car Hops, Hoops, and Class of 1812. So if anybody has any of those games, let me know. I also have a series of videotapes you might have received in the mail or bought at pinball shows in prior years. Number 4, the new tape is done and available here today. I've got a whole box full of them. I also have the first 3 tapes, also available, $6 each, basically covers the cost of the tape. I would also like to move forward on the tape project. I now have a new camera, and I have a faster duplicating system, so I can now turn out 3 or 4 tapes at a time instead of doing them one at a time. And I'd like some feedback on what people thought of the other tapes, whether you like the cluttered, unprofessional look, whether you like a tutti frutti mix of games, or whether you like the new plan on number 4, which is all the System 1 games that Gottlieb did. 16 games in depth in a 2-hour tape, along with some analysis of production numbers and showing you some things that changed as they went along. The 5th tape is done and ready to be duplicated. That'll be an all back glass tape called Girls Don't Make Passes at Guys with Back Glasses. Number 6 is going to be the Road to Hell tape. We're going on a road trip around Vegas to look at other collectors and their collections, people who collect those awful new games. And also I need people who might have shot some video of their collection or anything on video. Please send it in, because I can now put your video onto my tapes and send it out with all the other ones. So if you're interested in helping me with the tape project, I'm trying to ramp up production to 1 tape every 90 days, and possibly even 1 tape every 60 days. But I need people to help me out by giving me feedback and or some video that you might have. Getting into the actual seminar today is how to make your game peppy. When I was a kid, one of my big complaints with pinball was that the games weren't peppy enough. I can remember playing a Williams Ding Dong as a kid thinking, boy, that ball just doesn't go all the way to the top when I hit it with the flipper. And then Williams came out in 1972 with a game called Spanish Eyes that featured DC-powered pop bumpers, and for me it was a real revelation to see what a properly powered coil could do to a ball. It was really zingy. And ever since then, they've been adding on other improvements, including digital controls and solid-state games that make the new stuff very, very peppy. My boy here, Hopper, is passing out a little pamphlet called How to Make Your Game Peppy. It's basically, I'm going to try to go real fast because we have a limited amount of time, and I want to have a little bit of question and answer period at the end. Also, if you've got any specific questions, just pull me over. I'll be in here. I can answer pretty much anything you want to know. Please keep in mind that everything I say here today is an opinion. Everybody's got an opinion on an asshole, so keep in mind that just because I say it doesn't make it truth. You could deviate a little bit one way or the other, and it's not necessarily gospel because I said it. Basically, what we're going to do is give you a quick overview on how you can add a little more power to your devices. I call them gizmos, bumpers, flippers, and side kickers on your older electromechanical games so that they will play more to the taste of today's players. One thing I've noticed is when today's players who've never played an EM game hop on an old machine, they're just not used to the pokey slowness. They want that zip, zip, zip that come with the digital games. So this is a couple ways you can do it. But first of all, the whole first page is basically a warning not to go out and create a Frankenstein monster. You can make a game as peppy as you want. If you want the ball to shoot off the flipper and go through the glass and stick in your ceiling, I can probably tell you the coil that would do that for you. The idea is pinball is not a game of brute force. It's a game of skill and timing, and if you get too much power, you remove the skill factor, and just every shot knocks down everything. Another thing to keep in mind is that the more power you put into your devices, the more strain you're going to put on those devices, the play fields underneath the devices, the posts that hold the rubber rings are going to get stressed,
And on digital games, your transistors are gonna get stressed. It's like building a cake or cooking soup. What you wanna do is act like a chef or an artist and be very subtle and not try to overwhelm the game with power, but add enough so that the ball will get from point A to point B consistently and more powerfully. That's pretty much it for the second page. Moving on to some general rules. Firstly and most importantly on digital games, it's important that you keep your line cords straight. As you know, digital games use a series of 1 and 0s to make logic, and if the cord is twisted into a knot, the 0s will get through there okay, but the 1s have the little hooks on them, on the end of the 1, and they'll get stuck in the cord. And that will make your game slow down a lot, so you don't want to do that. And for those of you who haven't caught on, that's a joke.
Audio guys with stereo.
Another thing you should do, the second item under general rules, is that your drop targets are going to be more in danger of breaking once you add more power to your flippers and bumpers. There's two things you can do to help prevent this. First of all, replace your targets with new targets. I said this last year at my seminar. You'd better get these targets while they're still available. The tooling and people like Steve Young that have invested the money into reproducing these targets may not be here forever. And it's a good idea to take a 30-year-old piece of plastic and replace it with a new plastic while it's still available. 20 years from now, you might look back at that expo you went to in the 90s thinking, boy, I wish I would have bought a set of targets for my Target Alpha. I guess $5 a piece at the time wasn't too much because now they're broken and I can't get replacements, so I guess the game is junk, I'll have to throw it out. Another thing you can do when you get a new drop target is backfill the back of it. I've had several people tell me that hot glue makes a good backfill for a target. I personally prefer a product called Goop, also available as E2000. You get it at a craft store or a hardware store. It's an industrial rubber cement. It's a fully solvented rubber product, so you pour it into the back cavity of the drop target, and as the solvent disappears, the rubber shrinks down into the cavity, pulling itself tight to the plastic. Now what this does is make for a thicker target, first of all, because you've got the rubber cement in the back of the target, and also because it is a rubbery thing, when the ball hits the target and twists it back, the rubber is going to take a lot of that force, and you won't get them cracking off as often. Goop's a good idea. Learn to love it. Everybody that's tried it has really liked it. Another thing here is you should buy new flipper bats. Steve Young has reproduced them. Steve Engel has a whole bunch of flipper bats in his booth. Again, you're dealing with a 30-year-old plastic that always has hairline cracks in it, and you're looking at that Gottlieb flipper bat thinking, well, it's only got 2 little cracks in it. I think I'll just clean it up, and since the cracks are underneath the rubber ring, it won't matter. Well, again, Steve Young told me that the die they used to make the Gottlieb Fat Boy flipper, the classic 70s flipper, it's at Foremost Plastic Company. Originally, it had 4 cavities in the die for making 4 flipper bats at once, and apparently they didn't send somebody back there to spray the dies with oil, and 3 of the cavities have rusted to the point where they can't be used, so they're down to making 1 flipper bat at a time, and at some point, when that die either wears out or gets ruined by rust or neglect, they're not going to pay the kind of money necessary to reproduce that tooling just to sell a few of them to collectors. If you need this plastic stuff, buy it now, seal it in bags, and put it in a dark place. 10 years from now, you'll be very glad. Flipper bats for the older games are still available. The short 58mm flippers are still available, both for Gottlieb and the Bally Williams one. But again, there's no guarantee that these are going to continue to be available. I also have been buying the faceted posts. If you've got any Gottlieb games from the 60s or 70s with the white faceted posts, they have a tendency to turn very yellow with any exposure to sunlight or air. The new posts that Steve Young and Foremost have been making are very white. They're an extremely white plastic and they look very nice on your game. I think they're between 20 and 25 cents depending on who you buy them from and what quantity you buy them from. Again, you want to spend an extra $5 to get some new posts for your game, or you just want to have it be old and beat up and broken. There's a lot of controversy about new fasteners. I like to add new fasteners to my games. A lot of people don't. That's again a personal taste thing. We went around and around about that last year. We won't get into it this year. Another good idea is the plastic bumper bodies that go on the upper part of the playfield, on the top of the playfield. Those are always yellow. They're always burned from the light bulb. And again, you better get them now while they're still available, because they're not always going to be available. And always, 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 when you get done rebuilding your game, put a new or a newly resurfaced ball in your game. A worn ball or a scratched ball will act like sandpaper. It'll rip your playfield paint off, and it'll cause the ball not to be as bouncy and as creamy and as smooth as a nice new ball. If you're into metal polishing, you can take your existing balls, and by using an empty Radio Shack solder spool, it's a perfect polishing jig. Your ball fits absolutely where it should in the center of the Radio Shack soldering spool, and you can hold it up to your cloth wheel, and it'll spin itself around and around on the plastic and polish itself. Very nice trick you can do with that. We're going to talk about the two kinds of springs very briefly, compression springs and extension springs. Compression springs are springs that come together and are compressed. They look like a little coil. Extension springs look like a coil, only they extend like this. I personally don't like compression springs in theory, because as they get squashed down and squashed down and squashed down, they lose their temper. But you see a lot of them, especially on the older games. My standard for compression springs is on your handout here. And if you've ever taken a bumper apart, you notice your springs are about this big. Well, that's just from being squashed down to nothing for years and years and years. There's no rust on it. You can usually pull it back out, put some of the temper back on it, or you can just spring for a new spring. And then getting into extension springs, every single Gottlieb flipper unit, for the Fat Boy flipper, the newer flipper that uses an extension spring, some mechanic has taken a big pair of pliers and yanked on it and pulled it, and there's a bunch of crinks in the middle of it. Just go ahead and throw it out. New springs are available, or you can pick them off scrap. Keep in mind that your spring should be just off its coil when it's at rest, and it should not be pulled more than 75% at its full extension. That's, again, don't try to follow that as I go along. It's all in your little handout. You can look at it later. Flipper bearings are those little white nylon things that go through the playfield that the actual shaft and shoe rides in. Those are subject to wear. If you're going through a game, and especially the newer Williams games, you'll notice that the flipper shaft and shoe has a tendency to flop a little bit left to right. And every time the flipper comes in, that left to right motion is going to get wasted, and that energy is not going to go into the ball, and it's going to cause even more wear as you go along. So it's always a good idea, if you've got any bearing wear at all, to go ahead and replace it. Again, bearings are under $1. You really shouldn't even think about it. Just throw them out and get new ones. There's also a problem with 60s games, wedge heads and things. The old bearing that they used to use was about 2 millimeters shorter than the current bearing, and that's why you see the gouges in the playfield on a lot of the 60s games right where the flipper went up. You'll see those curvy shapes.
Run, what are we talking about? How many machines are going to be coming out with?
Well, I mean, we'll build as many as we can, but today with, you know, the market being a bit soft and having less time to do additional releases, you know, it's probably going to be a game that's going to be limited to probably, 2,000 machines or so.
How about the Titanic?
Titanic won't be out till later this year.
You should have had it tied in with the movie, Titanic. It's like...
No, Austin Powers is a novelty game that we made at Sega Pinball. It's a coin redemption game that has all of Austin's greatest Shaq type lines. Boy, I was thinking, right now, X-Files was really hard. X-Files was brutally hard because not so much Chris Carter and Jillian and the actors, but pretty much all of their handlers that wanted to protect them. South Park's proving to be difficult because things like Robert Smith as Mothra, they don't find pieces, some engineering first offs, some original artwork, playfields, some Star Wars and some other things are in there, some virtual art pieces. X-Files. That's what we're doing here. Yes. Okay, we'll do a last call. We'll do a last call. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do a last call. Raffle tickets. He designed the games. 3069865. 3069865.
Baywatch manual, bag, and Star Trek class.
3069577. 3069577. 3069577. 3068695. 3068695 is next. 3068695.
Dane, stop going up there.
3068696. The backlash is not a run backlash. That is a prototype backlash that is not yet run on the press. We will.
Half lit off.
I wish John could be here because really this is his moment. He and Lonnie. I saw Larry last night. He said, guys are probably still working on this thing, and they were. All the decals are not on the game. This is still prototype artwork. Testing will begin for another couple of weeks. You can see there's something unique about the game. If anyone is familiar with the golden cube, or the profile of the golden cube with the white head, that's what we're looking to do. There you go. Take a look at the header.
About that, our king of pinball.
Okay, we need to see if, okay, I'd like a volunteer from the audience to see if they can tell me what some of the games are. Greg, come on. Come on, Greg. Come on. Okay. Okay. I'll take a volunteer. Tax from Mars here. No, kidding. Okay. Okay. Sam, you already know the answer to this. You have to sit down. Who would like to come up and come on? Some of them are made up, but you have to see what you can find here. What's this one?
Jeopardy.
It's
Jeopardy.
Jeopardy.
Fireball.
Fireball.
And next. That's it out. Okay, you're up. Start right here.
Apollo 13.
Dun, 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 dun. Anyway, you'll all have an opportunity to compete today on Golden Q. Oren, you want to come down and talk about the rules? Okay, I'm going to give this over to Oren. He'll tell you how to play. You're going to see something else very unique on this game. There are check marks on the bottom arch. There are 6 of them. And as you complete your features, each check mark next to each feature illuminates. And that's how you know you're completing the game. So I'm going to give it over to Oren. And when you see John tonight, you see Lonnie tonight, congratulate them on having the vision to look into the past, look into the future.
So anyway, this is a very simple game. A lot of our customers are always asking for simplicity. You know, they don't want the most complicated thing. They want things that novices can play because, you know, there are a lot of us here who love pinball, but if we were the only ones who played, every operator in the world would love it as far as pinball is concerned. So you may notice that if you take a look at this play field, that it's very similar to a classic game. We have a 7 bank of drop targets here with pool balls and then 6 stand-up targets behind them.
Buying tickets anyway, right?
Why don't you tell me about your game, John?
Okay. What is the control so far?
Everything we're showing you.
Okay.
Oh, we got a lot.
The idea of the game is for all familiar with the IT Golden Key Golf game is to be able to link all the games together into a USA tournament.
50 cents per play. And that money is put into a prize fund for all the players. So let's say it's $1 for your entry fee. Well, 50 cents would go into the cash box like the normal 50 cents that would be split between the operator and the location. The other 50 cents would go into the tournament. And some of that money goes into administering the tournament, the cost of the server, and score validation, and prize distribution. The rest goes into the prizes for the players. So, tournaments will last about two or 3 weeks. And at the end of that time, the highest score on for the United States with cash prizes, then that player who wins those cash prizes is not eligible to play the tournament for a short period of time. But in addition to the United States tournament, every individual game will have its own tournament. So when you pay the entry fee, you're basically playing two tournaments. You're playing in a tournament for the bar, and you're playing in for the U.S. So you can also play against your buddies in the bar.
Good to see your ticket.
We got a slide adjustment here. Now I'm going to talk about how the way the game rules work. Instead of it being a ball and play game where a better player tries to keep the ball played as long as possible, to accumulate as many points as possible, it's more like pool or darts, where the better player is really going to finish faster, and the intermediate or the always raises the right out lane save post. The left one always raises the left one, and if you press both at the same time, it always raises the center post. Just up and down. It's enough that if you have to use good timing to be able to block the ball, and then have time to recover the ball, and we're still tweaking that aspect. But basically, some of the English games we've made, we put this feature in over the past couple of models, and we decided to put it into this game, a permanent feature in this game. So this will be the first U.S. game that U.S. players see with the post-save feature in it. And so theoretically, even when you're on ball 5, you say you have a really high count, really high value, you can still keep that ball in play at that point by using the post-save feature.
We're going to need the pin dolly because we're going to move this in and get it set up for the tournament. The other games will be coming over later today. John, I'm sorry there was a miscue on the time, but you're here in time. Everybody, I think, when you see Lonnie, Rob, and John, and you have an opportunity to play this game and experience and talk about the new strategy of playing. It's sort of like bowling. If you have two good bowling teams competing against each other, you find the last frame or two, everybody starts getting a little worried because that's what separates a lot of bowling leagues, those last couple of frames.
And the other thing is this
We're going to have to ask you to move again. We need you to move.
They would have dropped that.
Okay, Bill, grab a seat, please. Have your attention. Several months ago, I got a phone call from an individual that thought he might be interested in speaking at this year's Expo. And at the time, I didn't really know who he was or what knowledge he had of the industry and of the games. But the more I talked to him, the more I liked him, and the more he emailed me, the more I figured this would be the kind of person we want for our show. They're both from Michigan, and they bring with them a knowledge of mechanical. They both play mechanical games, as well as have solid-state games in their collections. They will speak today on bulletproofing the Gottlieb System 80. Clay Harrell and Rob here, please up front.
Okay, I'm Rob Hayes. This is Clay Harrell. Clay wrote this document. It's posted on the internet. The date and the address are posted on the handout. Okay. When I first realized I could do this, I work at an inner city hospital in Detroit. And I was talking to some of the surgeons, and I mentioned, I'm presenting a paper at a conference, And all the doctors, they think, oh, original research, or something. Yeah, what are you doing? Oh, I'm doing this article on bulletproofing Gottlieb systematic pinball games. And this one trauma surgeon looked at me, another surgeon looked at me, and said, why would people shoot at a pinball? they were serious. I mean, this is it's like, no, it's just a phrase, It's just, they're not so reliable, and we're trying to make it reliable. Okay, the address on the page that was handed out addresses you to a marvelous Mars Mechanical Museum. We got to give credit to him. This is his site that allows us to post this on the internet. He's paying money. So it goes to there, and when you scroll down through it, you get to the bottom, and it says, click here for information on fixing pinball machines. As you can see, that's Clay's Blake ad. And we go to bulletproofing Gottlieb system 8.
So we have a number of other repair papers.
So 1-800.
Refacing Gottlieb targets on EM machines, and also an electromechanical repair guide, and also a restoration guide on how to restore EM pinball machines. But right now we're going to go to bulletproofing Gottlieb system 80s.
Okay. The problem with System 80 games was two things: manufacturing and design problems. Okay, during manufacture, it was early in the development of the electronic production techniques, and they along with a lot of other electronic board producers, made a lot of classic mistakes. Okay, also there were some design features that need to be corrected. Gottlieb sent out bullets to correct these things, and we've included some of these. Okay, if you go down the table of contents, you can see that it's broken down into 3 sections. Mandatory fixes, we recommend you go through your game and do every single one of the mandatory fixes. Okay? Suggested fixes, you wouldn't have to do them, but it might ensure game reliability a little more and game safety. And then other information and fixes, you should go through that and familiarize yourself with what's in there. Depending on which problems you may have, the answer to your problems may be in there. And that's sort of, we lumped a lot of miscellaneous information. Okay, we listed the game, Clay listed the games that are made, predominantly applies to the System 80 games listed on the left, System 80A games listed on the right, and then System 80B listed at the bottom. For the true novice, we recommended what kind of tools and equipment you might like to have. Okay, these soldering iron, where to get it, wire wrap, so on, so forth. Go through. This is all there. If you're on the internet, you can get to this and find it. If you're not on the internet, Clay does have a few copies of this. You got to pay him for the copy fee you pay. It's like $5 to get a copy of it. Okay, when we talk about the mandatory circuit board defects, okay, they had a couple problems. Okay, the number one problem, when they run these things through, the leads are all real long, and they solder them, and they take them off, and they have all these big long wires sticking on the bottom, and they got to cut them all off. Well, when they cut them off too short, and they cut into the solder meniscus, or the mound, where the solder sort of mounts up onto the wire on the bottom of the board. Well, when they cut into that solder and the wire, it creates a fracture, and it ultimately can cause electricity not to flow through that fracture. So you have to resolder every single solder meniscus that you see that's cut. Okay. Secondly, these are two-sided boards generally, and to get the wire from one side of the board to the other, these traces disappear in a hole that has a copper in it, and then on the other side of it continue and run somewhere else. When it gets soldered, it's supposed to suck solder up into those holes. Well, it didn't always. So you have to go through and you have to resolder every one of those holes. Okay.
This isn't just limited to Gottlieb machines either. For instance, this picture is not a Gottlieb. This is a Williams WBC board off of Gilligan's Island. So don't think that this is just a Gottlieb problem. This could be Diddy East, it could be Williams, it could be anybody. So keep that in mind. And matter of fact, this game did have some problems, and after I fixed
these. And also you can see there's some defects, some soldering puckering where the soldering actually went in. The game indeed worked.
After you go through, you have to look for that also and fix any of those solder defects. This is true of all the boards we're going to speak about from now on. We're not going to necessarily mention it every time we talk about the board, but when you work on the driver board, power supply board, the CPU board, that, along with what we say, is what you have to inspect and make sure that you fill all these in. Okay, next thing is the power supply, okay? It had a design error and it had some common problems. They made a mistake. They had a problem with it. One resistor was I think, underpowered. I'm not sure the correct term. Wait a second, testing guide. And you have to replace one of the resistors. I believe it's a 680 ohm, has to become a half watt from a quarter watt. And because it was a quarter watt, it caused this 1N47388 diode to burn. So you have to replace the diode, put the proper resistor in. Also inspect the 12K ohm resistor. It's often cracked. Okay, would you point out where these are at?
Yeah, one of the problems is when they designed this circuit board is actually a holdover from the system, the Gottlieb System 1s. And this resistor R10 was a different value. It was a 680 ohms in the System 1. But when they went to System 80, for some reason they changed the value. They lowered it, which allowed more current to pass through diode CR7. And you can see the effect. You see the burn marks on the board. So what we're essentially doing is returning this back to the System 1 design, the System 1 value on resistor R10, replacing CR7 because it quite often fails, and also replacing R3 because it quite often fails. And the way that you get these things out is using your cheap Radio Shack desoldering tool. They're available for like $10. Buy some extra tips too, because it'll eat tips like you eat dinner. And they also sell two kind of tips too. They sell an ironclad and then a really cheap one. Get the ironclad one. They last a little longer, but the thing was useless without a good tip. So and it's actually quite a good tool, and it's easy to use, and you'll find a lot of uses for it.
Okay. We've detailed the instruction on these fixes in a step-by-step thing. Resolder any leads, look like they're cut too short, so on, so on, so on, so forth. Clay designed it. We corrected it so it's a shopping list of the parts you need, and then a recipe of how to follow it to fix your game. Another problem that the power supply board had was that the transistor that's on there, when you see the board, there's a transistor that generates a lot of heat. And there's a big heat sink on the back of the board. Okay, there you can see it. Okay, that's the front of the board and the back of the board. You have to unsolder that transistor first of all so you can access the back of the board. Take it off. Where the wire lugs came through, these holes are often, there's like an eyelet that fits on the board there. So that when you repeatedly solder and unsolder, it doesn't destroy the trace. But the solder oftentimes doesn't grab from the eyelet down to the pad, so it doesn't make a good connection. You have to re-solder that so it's nice and smooth and thick around the eyelet. Okay. Also, we recommend you add these test points to the board. See on TP4 plus 5 volts. That's just a little dot you would touch with your probe. That's sort of crazy when you're trying to test voltage. You just put a little wire hook on there you can clamp your alligator clips on. We also mentioned that you have to touch up one of the traces under the big capacitors on this board too.
Well, the other problem associated with the way the transistor bolts to the board using these eyelets is the solder mount around these. See, the ground is a major portion of this transistor. The ground is actually part of the case of the transistor. You know, it's like a lead on the transistor. And if there isn't a good connection right here,
on the other side of the board.
Right, it won't. You won't get good contact, and you'll have power supply problems. The other problem that we're finding a lot is any game of this age. You know, you got a game that's pushing 20 years. The filtering caps that take the AC voltage. See, what happens is these games all work on DC voltage. So everything you plug into the wall is AC voltage. So the power comes into a transformer and knocks it down to a set voltage, say 15 volts, and then it goes through a bridge rectifier and a capacitor, which effectively smooths the voltage from a rippling AC thing to a nice, smooth, and flat DC line. The problem with games of this age, and this isn't just related to Gottlieb, it could be Williams, it could be anybody, is that the filtering cap wears out. Because a capacitor is basically really, it's not so much an electronic device as it is a mechanical device, and they wear out. The problem is that as the cap starts to fail, instead of the voltage being nice and smooth, it'll start to wave a little bit, which means the voltage will start to vary a little bit, which means your game can reset in the middle of a game. And this happens on lots of games, not just Gottlieb.
These boards are meant to run on about 4.8 to 5.2 volts. Okay, they can stand a little bit outside that, but once they get too far beyond that, then they don't run. That's when they reset. You'll be playing all of a sudden the game resets. You know, well, what's happened? You know, got this big problem. It's because it may be because the voltage drifted outside the 4.8 to 5.2 range. It's trying to chase this wavering DC, and by replacing this capacitor, you eliminate a major problem. You don't see it so much in newer games. They're not so old, but in 10 or 20 years, that's going to be a problem. This is also a problem on the Bally games, on one of the high voltage and driver board, I think it's called. They have a capacitor, and when it goes bad, it will cause the same problem. You just replace that same big capacitor. Okay, see, I'm not.
Yeah, you see, this gentleman's talking about it's happening on System 9 and System 11 games. And once again, the last System 11 game made was in 1990, so we're approaching that 10-year window. To get life of more than 10 years out of an electrolytic capacitor, you know, you're just asking for trouble. So once you hit that 10-year window, you got to expect to replace these. The other thing to notice too is there's another electrolytic capacitor right up here. Now what this one does is this filters or smooths the voltage for the solenoids. This one, it doesn't really matter if it fluctuates. I mean, it's affecting the voltage going to the solenoids, where the 12-volt one here is affecting the voltage going to the boards, because the boards all run on plus 5 volts. And if that's the voltage that's critical, the other voltages aren't nearly as critical. I mean, you can have fluctuating voltages for your flippers, and you're not going to really notice.
In an effort to really make sure this is comprehensive, we talk about bridge rectifiers and testing them. We're not going to go into a whole lot about them right here, how to replace them. The next thing we'll go to, I think, is the CPU board. Okay, these CPU boards had a battery on them, and the battery was to save high scores and game adjust functions, I believe. And it's that square data centric box. Most people don't even recognize it as a battery. You've got to get these batteries off the board. Oftentimes you'll find them with corrosion. This corrosion can be fixed. Now Clay can fix boards where the corrosion traveled, inches into the board, and he has no problem with it. Basically, we say get the battery off the board. He gives guidelines on how to replace it with a new battery. He also gives guidelines on how to replace it with a 1 farad capacitor. That's a 1 million microfarad capacitor or larger. Okay, it'll never corrode like a battery would and destroy your board. The drawback might be that you have to leave the game on for 4 or 6 hours the first time to charge it up, and turn it on for maybe an hour or so a month to keep it recharged. If you left it off for a long length of time, it would discharge, you'd forget your values, but it wouldn't hurt anything. It's also cheaper than batteries.
Yeah, this cap costs about $2. You don't have to effectively ever replace the battery because there isn't one anymore. It really, I think it's a great solution for the hobbyist. And one thing that Rob didn't really stress that we need to say is that Rob and I are both hobbyists. We're not in the business. We don't professionally repair pinball machines. This is just our hobby. This is fun. Okay, so, we don't know everything, but these are just like the things that we've found that have worked for us as hobbyists. If you were an operator, maybe this wouldn't work for you for whatever reason. But for us, as a hobbyist, this is what we found that works great. And these caps, they're $2 from the supply house, and you can forget about ever having to change your batteries. And we talk about the corrosion, how to fix the corrosion, if you do have that problem, what general things are affected by corrosion, because the corrosion is like a cancer. If you have lung cancer, the cancer starts in your lungs, and it can spread outward into your body. This isn't that much different. The battery corrosion will start obviously around the battery and spread outward.
Okay, next we're going to go to the driver board, and on that there's several things that are unrelated that we have to mention, and the fix for each of these problems. Okay, there's 3 separate grounds on the board at least, and if one ground varies from another ground by more than, say, half a volt, weird things can happen. The board can reset. You can burn out coils. So what has happened is we've looked for a way, the best way to tie all these grounds together. Okay. Also, they had some problems with, again, contact on driving transistors with the ground pads. So we have recommendations on how to fix that all at once. What's happened is this is a big, long, involved directions here. So we're going to really just go through the pictures, show you the pictures, explain what's going on. On the instructions, we might say, go to this tab here and find it, locate this other one, and run a jumper wire here. And it explains the instructions real well. But you can compare the pictures to make sure that the instructions we've given you are right. You don't have to be worried about the fact that you're not doing it properly. Why don't you go back to the first one? Okay. There's three transistors that don't make good contact at a pad underneath them. Okay, right here, that's a grounding pad. Well, they were not tinned from the factory. Okay, they had no solder on; they were masked off. Well, with time, the copper that was there starts to like oxidize. Copper oxide. You never see shiny pennies, you know, that are made out of copper. That they get dull real fast. Well, the same thing happens on the pads on the board, and that ground disappears. So you take off those transistors, you tin the pad, okay, and also this insulating mica usually runs all the way around. You cut it right there so it can make good contact between the metal case of the transistor and the grounding pad. You also are going to go through and fill in unsoldered vias as are typical, and as you can see there. Okay.
Yeah, the main problem with the Gottliebs is that you have these different grounds. You've got a logic ground, you have a solenoid ground, I believe there's another ground. So you have three different grounds, and if any of them vary by as much as a half volt between each other, the game can go into, it'll basically lock. Or, you know, it has to be manually reset or turned on or off or whatever. And the problem is if the machine locks in a particular state, it can burn out displays because the displays are actually what they call strobe. The voltages are actually turned very quickly on and off. Well, if the board locks on, the voltage is locked on, it'll send this constant voltage that's not being strobed anymore to your displays, and it can burn them out. Likewise, it can do the same thing to the coils. The coils will lock on, and you know, your game will smoke. So what we're trying to do is equalize these grounds, because remember, these games all work in a logic system. So you have, you know, ones and zeros. Well, a 1 is plus 5 volts, and a 0 is ground. But if you have two different kinds of grounds that vary between, you know, by as much as a half volt, it gets confused. It's just a machine, and it's got to be, everything's got to be black and white. You know, it's got to be 0 or 5, anything in between, and it's confused. So you get these in betweens, and you have problems. So we're just trying to correct them. And there's steps. We lay them all out. What you have to do, pictures to do them. It's really pretty easy. And then, yeah, in one case we actually have to drill a hole in the board to pass a wire through, kind of like making our own plated through hole, but you know, obviously it's not plated through. The only other way to do that would be to run the wire actually physically around the outside of the board. This is just neater. You know, so we have all the steps to identify all this, which we're obviously not going to bore you to death showing you.
Okay, I think one of the nicest things that come out of this paper is when I got in these electronic games, I could test a resistor, and I can see how much resistance there is, but how could I test anything else? I couldn't find out how. Clay described how to test the transistors, okay? Basically, we're just going to explain the one here, and there's some minor variation. He's explained for all the transistors in the game. Okay, on this one, the MPSU45 is a very common transistor. There's probably 20 of them, or 25 or 30 of them on this board. Okay, you take one of these digital multimeters and you put it on diode setting. Okay, and then with the game off, which was a question that was asked to us, you put the red lead on the middle trace of the transistor. Okay, that's the base. Also, it's the top, I believe, has a middle tab on top. That's also that you put the red lead there. Then you take the black lead and you touch each of the outside ones in turn. Okay, you should get 1.3 on the emitter lead and 0.7 on the collector. You know, it might be 1.2 or 1.4, but it's going to be really close. It might be 0.6 to 0.8, but it's going to be very close. Anything outside of that transistor's bad. It's got to be replaced. He lists detailed instructions on all these. And this menu, if you click on that, it'll throw to another section in section 3, that other information. It'll explain how to test all of them. But while this board's off, it's a good idea to test them all, replace the ones that need to be replaced, and then move on. He also shows substitutions.
Yeah, and what we're really trying to do is come up with a systematic way to fix a game, because that's the big problem when you buy a game and it doesn't work and you bring it home, you want to fix it, but it's like, where do I start? You know, what do I do? You know, what's the first thing I need to do? So we're trying to identify steps that you can very systematically follow to solve all these problems. So theoretically, if you do all this stuff, you plug all the boards in, and assuming all the chips are good, hey, it'll work, you know? And believe it or not, between the two of us, we bought maybe, I don't know, half dozen System 80 games in the last 6 months. And we've done this, and man, I mean, it works. You know, it's I won't say it's fail-proof or foolproof, but man, it sure makes things a lot easier. Yeah.
Okay, last thing is, there's a connector, I'm gonna picture this. There's a connector that runs from the CPU board to the driver board. And these are double-sided boards, and the +5 volts and the ground are located on both sides of these boards. On this connector, there's only wires from like the front of the board to the front of the next board. You need to add another pair of wires from the back of the board to the back of the second board to double up the +5, to double up the ground, to again ensure reliability. It's just as simple as getting a wire, put connectors on, and plugging them into the plugs. Okay.
Another problem with System 80s is relating back to the battery. When the battery corrodes, it basically sends off this cancerous, gaseous material that will corrode anything in its way. And one thing that gets affected a lot of times is the connectors going between all the boards. If you have even slightly corroded connectors, it can create a reliability problem. The game just works, it can work one day and not work another. You jiggle the connectors and all of a sudden it works again. Well, you know, in a situation like that, I mean, I don't know, that kind of stuff really bothers me. You know, you turn a game on and all of a sudden it doesn't work for whatever reason, and I got to monkey with it. So we've come up with, you know, you can buy extractor tools to take the pins out of each connector, and we show how to replace them. A friend of mine actually drew, Bob actually drew these diagrams on how to remove the pins from the edge connectors. And he actually even sells the parts. He did this for a customer, and gave me permission to scan it. And he shows how to replace them and the tools to use. And also when sometimes the connectors will just be totally wasted and just unusable, or even the plastic housings have rotted and you can't get the pins out. We even kind of describe, you know, what you can do to replace the entire connector, and how to get around that. I don't want to spend too much time on connectors because it's kind of tedious and boring, but it's something that has to be addressed on this machine and many others of other brands of this age too.
Okay, next we're going to go to the pop bumper driver boards. Gottlieb had a system where the pop bumpers were driven by these little driver boards. They're like a 2-inch by 3-inch board. Okay, on these boards they had a wrong design, which they determined it needed to be modified. And the way you tell is you look at the board on the left, it has 2 diodes, CR1 and CR2, and the design on the right has been modified. It has 1 diode and a jumper, and that's the way to tell if it's right. Okay, you cut each of those off, unsolder them, replace the capacitor with a new capacitor. In the instructions, you have to actually turn the capacitor around, so what was negative before now becomes positive. Notice we draw a negative line on the left board, where the original negative trace of the capacitor was. After you cut off, put the new one on, you put positive that way, you cross the negative, so it becomes positive that way. There's never any mistake again if you're ever working on this board which way the capacitor goes on, and you just put a jumper wire through there and solder it. You also, again, resolder all the poor solder connections on the back. And as we forgot to mention earlier, the header pins often were poorly soldered and they cracked. And the headers are the pins that stick straight out of the board that the connectors connect to. Because these get pushed on and off and they get wiggled, if they have a little
screws work loose on those transistors as well, causes grounding problems.
Yeah. If you resolder all these header pins, you can look at them, half of them be cracked. You just reflow more solder, build up this big solder mount on the back of the board on that, and it will fix that problem.
Yeah, what these pop bumper driver boards essentially did is they allowed the pop bumper jumpers to be kind of computer controlled. So if you hit the switch, the pop bumper switch, it would send a timed pulse to the coil to turn it on, instead of just having like a hardwired system where the switch was hit and the coil locks on. Like if the switch was misadjusted, these kind of remove that problem from the system without having to use any driver transistors on the driver board. Because what happened was Gottlieb was making some fairly complicated games during this period that had a lot of coils, and they were running out of driver transistors on the board. So this was their interim solution. And there was actually, to score points, there was a repetitive switch. So you had one switch that actually turned the pop bumper driver board on, and then that in turn would turn on the pop bumper coil, which would pull the coil in, and then a mechanism would hit another switch that was actually connected back to the driver CPU board that actually scored the points. So this way they didn't have to use any transistors on the driver board.
Okay, I'm going to see what else we're at here. Back of the board, you can solder on either lead. It's really not so important. This is the original Gottlieb fix, what do you call it, schematics, technical service bulletin on fixing it. It's not ours, Gottlieb came up with it. They realized they made a mistake and they fixed it. Okay, pull-up resistors. Again, Gottlieb had so many coils on these boards, they ran out of driver transistors for them. So what they did was they took one of these little MPSU45 transistors I mentioned earlier that were meant to drive light bulbs. And they said, well, why don't we drive a coil with them? Well, you can't because light bulbs are 6 volts, 5 volts. Coils require a lot more. So what they did was they took this MPSU45 that was supposed to be a light transistor, and they said, well, we'll drive a bigger transistor with it, turn it on, and then it can handle the power of the coil, and it'll operate. Well, up until black hole, it was wired in one way, okay? There's a drawing of it. The collector is connected to ground, okay? And that's just a tab and screwed onto the case of the connector. An emitter wire, and they had just a single wire here that ran to 24 volts. Well, because the voltage on these games fluctuated, if this voltage of 24 dropped, well then because of the difference between 24 and ground?
Well, what happened is that the way that the transistor worked is that if the voltage got interrupted to the transistor, it basically turned on the device that this transistor was controlling. So this would be fine, but if the game locked into an unknown state, it could drop the voltage to this and lock this coil on. So what this pull-up resistor does is it ties plus 24 volts more or less in kind of a permanent manner to this lead, so that if the CPU gets locked for some reason, the coil that is driven by this won't lock on and burn. So this was just their solution. This was their technical bulletin that Gottlieb came up with. They started doing this in the middle of production in like Haunted House or Black Hole, and it needs to be done. I mean,
They actually put the wrong resistor on in some of the black holes, so you got to check and make sure you have the right powered resistor. If you do, you just take it off their little resistor block and put the right one on. If it's not on there, you have to find 24 volts. We explained many different places to find it. Run a wire to a 20 resistor, and then run a wire to the proper lead of the transistor and solder it on. It's that simple, and that's taken care of. Okay, those are all the mandatory things. Okay, we moved through them here in like 15, 20 minutes, I don't know how long. Clay, I think, can pull through all these in about an hour's worth of work on boards because this is fast.
yeah, this is like Tim Arnold talked about this, putting capacitors across the leads of the coil as a suggested thing to minimize the arcing between the switches. And the reason why you want to minimize the arcing is anytime you get an arc, it burns the contacts of the switch just a little bit. If it burns them enough, you build up resistance in the switch. At some point, you'll get so much resistance that either the coil won't work or it'll cause some other kind of problems associated with that. And the other thing we had too is on these on the kicking rubbers, which aren't CPU controlled. I had a fuse in the system too, so if they lock on, it blows the fuse instead of cooking the device. Because once again, they're not CPU controlled, they have this redundant switch. So they have power hooked up to the coil, and they have a sensing switch on the playfield. The playfield switch activates the coil. As the coil mechanism pulses or moves down to kick the ball, then it hits another redundant switch, which actually scores points to the CPU board. Well, the problem is if the switch on the playfield locks on for some reason, there's nothing in the path to turn it off. There's no fuse in the path except for the whole solenoid powered fuse to turn this particular device off, and the coil will burn. So if you were an operator, this was a nightmare, because if the switch was adjusted too closely or something got bent by the ball, this would lock on, the game would burn, and the operator would be getting a call and would be be losing income. And the other thing is like, I mean, just for us, you have friends over playing your games, or you got kids playing your games, you don't want to be constantly monitoring this stuff. So put a fuse in there. Hey, if the fuse blows, no big deal. You replace the fuse and fix the switch at a later date.
Okay, as again, just to point out, we put a picture, the recipe, and the shopping list. Okay. Okay. Another suggested haunted house had a problem where once these switches got pitted, they made poor connection, they didn't provide enough current to the coil to kick the ball up. So I think StarTech suggested that you use a pop bumper driver board in this application. It was a perfect application for one of these. Unfortunately, they had it wired up wrong. Okay. This is the correct wiring of how to do that. We're not going to go into details. It's all in there. If you got a haunted house, you can do it. You can also add this to Black Hole, but generally Black Hole doesn't have a problem with getting these balls from the bottom playfield to the top. Okay.
Yeah, and
Black Hole doesn't use K relay. It's really not.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, it's got that.
And also
Under
the
playfield.
haunted house is kicking the ball straight up,
Right.
where Black Hole's kicking it at an angle too, so that's a problem. Anytime you have a ball going from a lower, trying to be driven 8 inches straight up, if there's a failure, I mean, you got gravity working against you and no time between it, so the ball goes up, doesn't make it, comes back down, hits the switch, activates again, knocks it back up. Doesn't make it, comes back down. Keeps on doing that repetitively until the ball comes up, but if the coil doesn't have the power or there's some other problem in the system, the ball is gonna just keep doing that until something burns. And ultimately, something does burn. Haunted House was notorious for this. I bought, every haunted house game I've bought, this has been a problem on, and the person always said the same thing. The ball would go on the lower playfield, and man, it would just get stuck and it would never go, and the next thing I knew, the thing was on fire. So I mean, it's great when you go to buy the game. $50, thank you very much. I'll be loading the cart, But it's, it's an easy fix. What you're doing is, what this gentleman was talking about is what they call a K relay. So it's a relay with 2 tungsten contacts, switches. And when the ball goes in there, the relay pulls these switches in, pulls the contacts together. It puts the power to the up kicker coil that knocks it up. Well, if the ball keeps on going up and down, the switch on the K relay will just start clapping like this. They will literally get red hot. I mean red hot. I've watched it. It's amazing. And you'll see them spark, and they'll burn, and then the coil they'll lock on, they'll burn together, the coil will burn. So when you put a pop bumper driver board in there, what it does is it removes this switch where there's potential resistance in there, so all the power goes to the coil. It also puts in a specifically timed for so many milliseconds pulse going to the coil, so it's precise, and man, it knocks the ball up every time. I mean, there's never a problem. It's amazing how easy it is.
Since you mentioned Black Hole, the question after reference to Black Hole, from everybody that I've talked to said the motor never works in the spinning unit in the Black Hole.
Oh, we'll get to that. Okay, next we'll talk about display nipples. Okay, this is on System 1 games, okay, there was a black plastic cover that covered up this little tiny glass nipple which you can't see in here, so you don't have to worry about it. On System 80, they stopped putting these on there. When you take these out or work with them, if you set them down, you're going to bust that little glass piece off, and your display's shot. So all we recommend here is you take some rubber tubing, surgical tubing, and silicone adhesive or hot glue. Put a little in the rubber tubing, a little on there, just push it on, let it harden, and you can drop those things, they won't break. I've done it. Okay, now 3A is on testing transistors. He lists on the driver board all the different transistors and how to test them. Okay, still 2N, 3055, down lower, on and on and on and on, how to test these transistors. There's some variance in them, so you got to look for each specific one on how to do it. But to me, this is, I couldn't find it anywhere, and it's on this document. Okay, 3B is transistor substitutions. Okay, some of these are hard to get. Well, for someone like me, I didn't know how to get them in place. Oh, geez, just look here, look there, and so we've listed them all. He's listed them all and where they're at. Okay. Next, there's a mistake in the Black Hole and Haunted House and possibly in other System 80 manuals about fuses. Okay, we know for a fact it's in Black Hole and Haunted House, so we've corrected on this. Basically on the F6 and F7, which it lists as illumination lamps, they had listed them as slow glow lamps. You don't want slow glow fuses on illumination. You want fast glow, so we corrected that.
Enough, they got it correct on the stickers on the display.
Right. Yeah, it's only wrong in the manual. It's right on the schematic. It's right on the little cards that you staple on the bottom of the playfields and my fuse, but it's wrong in the manual. 3D is CPU board revision modifications. There was different boards. Here, 001, 102, 001, and then 107. They need to run on a 107 configuration. If you have a 102, you have to go through this procedure on you jumper here, you jumper there, you do this, you do that. We're not going to go into it. 3E is section on score displays, okay? We learned a lot about displays in the course of doing this. Don't ever swap displays with the power on, because if you do, you're going to burn out these chips that are on the board. I got to see, I don't remember the other things. Secondly, we had a lot of displays that were bad. And then we saw a posting about brightening score displays. So we said, well, maybe ours are just dim. So I put them back in the game, turned the lights out, and these things were faintly lit. So we sort of tried to figure out what the posting said and looked at it and tried to figure out how we could easily apply this to a game. You know, I wanted to take 12 to 18 volts. You know, where do you get 12 to 18 volts from? You know, I had this weird transformer, but most people don't. So what Clay came up with was that capacitor that you replaced in the power supply mod has 12 volts. So you take a jumper and you hook it up to one lug of the capacitor. Make sure you don't short it across the capacitor. And you run one of those jumpers to the end lead of the display. Doesn't matter which end lead. Then you hook up a jumper to the other lead and jumper it to the end lead on the display. You turn the game on for 5 to 10 seconds, and the oxide that's on these wires begins to glow. Okay, it burns off the oxide coating after, you know, 5. They glow immediately, but you leave it on for like 5 to 10. You take them off, you put them back on, turn off. They're as bright as can be. So they're not, in a lot of cases, they're not burned out. They're just dim.
That's 12 volts.
Yeah, I ran it on 25 volts.
I fixed them with 6.
I've done on 25.
Some fixes, some doesn't. So if you do
If they
12,
quickly fade back, that means the tube has got a small leak.
Is that, okay.
If they stay bright, the tube will probably stay that way for a long time. If they fade quickly after you re-brighten them, it means the tube has a vacuum.
similar to a picture you're burning out
You
oxidation.
should count the wires too. Sometimes these wires break. You don't have 5 wires. I wouldn't mess with the tube. I'd get rid of it.
And you wanted the wires to glow red. If they're glowing white, that means you're putting too much voltage on it. Rob and I played around. We went as high as 25 volts on this stuff.
Left it on for like 20, 30 seconds to see what happened. I used AC voltage one time to see if that made a difference. It didn't matter.
Yeah, it didn't matter. Could have used AC or DC, but it's just this. The only thing is, if you're doing this on the score display, which is a smaller display, it has shorter grid lines across here. You have to use. You really should use a lower. You can still use 12 volts, but it's really suggested to use between 6 and 8 volts, just because the lines are shorter. They're easier to burn up. Just keep an eye on it.
Less time.
Yeah, less time is really a good solution to that. We talked a little about the auxiliary lamp driver board. What that is it's a small board that controls the lights in the back glass. On Black Hole, it's a marquee style light. In Volcano, it's a marquee style light. In Haunted House, it's the lightning bolt in the back glass. And just you can use the boards between the games, but you have to change a resistor in it to a different value to change the timing of it. And then we have some more repair comments, things in operation. These are just problems that we have come up with and maybe solutions, what worked for us.
This is important, okay? If you have problems with your games, this is where you're going to jump to, okay? It's not starting up right. These are maybe a logical way to go through to look for common problems that prevent the game from starting or from operating, okay? We had a lot of. Then there was some little bit with sounds. We threw it on if you're in sound problems. These are some things to check. And again, with solenoids, an area where you could check with solenoids. Now we had a question about a Black Hole motor fix.
What I did is I took my Black Hole motor apart, and what happens is the motor is just a cheesy motor, and it's on all the time. So what I did is I went to Radio Shack and hey, I bought another cheesy motor, and figured out a way to put it in. And it cost me a couple bucks and maybe an hour's worth of my time to take the old motor apart, put the new one in. Now this assumes that your gearbox is good. Okay, so what you do is you have a small motor that turns at a fair number of RPMs going into a gearbox that ultimately goes to the spinning disc that goes at maybe 10 RPMs. So the gears that transfer the high RPM motor to the low RPM spinning disc, a lot of times those are wasted. If they're wasted, there's You can replace the motor all you want, it's not gonna fix the problem. But what I did is show them an instruction set on how to replace the motor. But this doesn't really solve the problem. So now you have a working motor that's on all the time still. So, you know, you're almost guaranteed that it's gonna burn out again. So what good has that done you? Well, what you can do is you can make a little board that turns the motor on only during gameplay. So when the game is just sitting there in attract mode, the motor's not spinning, but as soon as you hit the start button, hey, it turns the motor on. So maybe the motor's on for your 3-minute game. Game's over, turns the motor off. Saves a lot of trouble on the board. And all I did is we bought this TIP 125 transistor. There's a couple of diodes that they use on coils. Put it on a little homemade printed circuitry board, hook it up to the motor, and away you go. It works great.
You wouldn't even have to put it on a board, I don't think. You could probably just solder these damn hanging, but it's probably not.
You could. I put it on a board, but whatever.
But that's clay.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen a Gottlieb Spirit.
No, I haven't.
Not
No.
Okay, well, it has the same spinning disc, and what they used was a large multi-products motor. And it uses a common Gottlieb bracket. You fit it in the back, and that motor is hefty. Lasts forever.
There's no room. These boards in the black hole are all situated, there's a space about this big between boards and wires that this motor fits. You can't put a multi-product.
Spirit is the same system. Same,
Check it out.
same setup.
Well, the problem is on the black hole, when you open the door, the boards are all mounted on the inside of the door, as opposed to being mounted in the black box, in the back box. So like in Haunted House, yeah, the inside of, I'm just guessing, because once again, I haven't seen it. But the space between the boards and where the motor mounts, it's very little room. So, I mean, I know what a multi-products motor is, I know how big they are. It wouldn't fit, you know, at least.
They have a bracket that spaces it away from the back.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So it suspends it above the boards?
Look at the Spirit. Really surprised.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Maybe the problem is getting that part.
We had a friend that, you know, I don't know, that guy doesn't really know much about games, you know, so we looked at his haunted house trapdoor, and the problems we encountered with that allowed us to give you some information about that in case you run into the same problems he had.
Basically, the trapdoor in the haunted house is a flipper coil. It has a high voltage pull-in side of the coil, and then it has a hold side of the coil. And, you know, it exhibits problems, and it's an easy thing to fix, so we went through that. There's also something called a Gottlieb System 80 reset board, starting with System 80A, Devil's Dare, and later machine. Instead of fixing all the ground problems and the reset problems that the game had, what they did is they put a watchdog board in that watches the games, the CPU to see the state of the CPU, and if it sees the CPU in the wrong state, the reset board resets the CPU, which theoretically reboots the game. So this was kind of a half-assed way to fix it's not really fixing the problem, it's like putting a big Band-Aid on it. I mean, it works, and they did it, but we talk about the reset board. You can actually find them and put them in your game. It's kind of unnecessary if you did all the ground fixes. Another problem with Gottlieb games is setting free play. There's no way to set free play. So you're either opening the coin door all the time, hitting the credit switch, or you're, you know, putting up a doorbell switch on the outside of your machine. I explain a way that's, maybe it's rinky-dink or not, but I like it. What it does is you've got 2 contact switches that go together that start the game. But what I do is I double them up so that there's 4 with a piece of fish paper between them. So when you press the start button, it first closes these 2, which adds a credit to the game, and then as the start button moves in, it closes these 2, which starts the game. So you have 0 credits, you push the button, it automatically adds a credit, and then automatically takes it off because you just started the game. So you never have to stick your hand in and you know, wiggle around with stuff, because there's no free play center. You know? Yeah, you should. Yeah, well, we won't go there.
At this point, we correct some problems that were in the manuals and schematics. We start listing transistors and coils. I mean, it's a convenience factor. You can find the schematics and trace them, but that's no fun, so you can just look on these lists, find out where they're going. I don't know what's more lists, right? We're winding down. Dip switch settings. Instead of looking through the manual, if you didn't have it, they'd be there. Bookkeeping settings, and that's it.
Okay, what time is it, number 1?
We got 20 after. We were also scheduled to do a Williams WPC repair. We're going to start that. We're not going to get too far in it, obviously, since we only have 10 minutes.
Come back next year. You guys be good.
Did you not discuss the system one system because it's so?
No, we haven't done anything with System 1. I have a haunted house over here that will turn on. It has all the modifications done to it. If you guys want to play it and check it out, you can see how the game operates. Everything's been done to that game. We've been trying to break it for 2 weeks now, and can't get it to break. It seems to be a good, reliable system. Also, this game's for sale. $800. Come see me. Blatant plug, blatant plug. Yeah, it's pretty nice. You can take a look. Okay, this whole document is 50 pages. We were going to print up 100 copies for you guys. There's about 100 seats in this room. I went to the photocopier to get them printed, and I nearly shat. It was like $4 per copy to have it printed, times 100. I was like, no way, I can't do that. So I had 20 copies printed up. If you guys don't have internet access and you want a copy, come see me. I'll sell you a copy for the cost of the photocopy, about $5. And you can have your own copy of the System 80 repair guide. If you have internet access, the location is on the top of the sheet of paper that I gave you, so you can just go there and print your own.
Also, there's a date on there, okay? We will be making revisions of this as we get comments and suggestions and test out these procedures. So say you print it up tomorrow, okay? And then in 6 months or a year, you get one of these games. You should go back and look at the document and compare the dates. If the date that's on there is newer than the date you have, print up the new date. You have to discard the old one and have more information. We're also soliciting any suggestions or comments or things we missed from people. We don't know everything. It'd be nice to gather it all in one area, while we can.
The one thing that we weren't able to cover because we were cut short on the time is we were going to do the Williams WPC. We'll most likely do this next year. What this is repairing Williams games from 1990 all the way up to their current product, which is Monster Bash. It's, again, it's actually over 50 pages long. I made photocopies of that document too, even though we're not covering it here. If anybody wants that, it's the same thing for the price of the photocopy, and you can have one of those.
Pardon me? Is the WPC on the internet as well?
Yep, it's all this stuff back here is on the internet. The WPC is here, electromechanical repair and restoration guide, the roto target, and the bulletproofing. They're all on the internet. That's why when we passed out 2 sheets of paper, one on the WPC guide with the URL to the location to the WPC, and one for the System 80.
So these fine gentlemen have just donated one of each of these. It'll be the auction tomorrow night. Now, you may say, well, what's the big deal? Because there's 19 copies left.
18, somebody else already bought.
Okay, these will be the only copies that will be autographed. I don't know how to use a pen, I only know how to type. So I don't know if that's possible.
So someone give me a pen right now, we will make sure.
And I'll put my X on it.
And if you want a bulletproof a Gottlieb System 80 game, you need 1/2-inch diamond point steel.
Hold on, they gotta sign it first, we gotta make sure they sign.
Any questions, we'll try to answer them.
Play your game.
And on the, he wants one of each. And gentlemen, if you have any questions on the WPC stuff, even though we can't cover it, feel free to grab either myself or Rob, and we'll try and answer your questions on that. I wish we had time to cover this, because I want to thank a lot of people on the WPC thing. We listed right here, like Jonathan works at a distributor. He really did a lot of work on this to help. This gentleman, John Sedek, same thing, he works at a distributor too. He did a lot of help with this WPC document too, and some other people. So I just want to thank them, and I want to thank Marvelous Marvin for providing the web space for all this. If it wasn't for Marvin, we wouldn't have it.
No, I don't think so. We should. No.
Okay, there'll be a quick pause here while I sell the books.
You should go to.
A chance to freshen up. take a drink, and we'll get started here shortly with our next seminar.
The first pinball machine in BC in Rock. Can you put your machine on so I can play? Did you guys put your machine on so we can play?
And don't forget, the audio tapes are available from Kevin in the back room. Z-Man Kevin is here. He'll be recording all the seminars, including the next one, the world famous Pat Lawler Show.
Yeah, leave your stand. Put the bag on.
Illinois, it's the Pat Lawler Show. Starring our game show host, Pat Lawler.
You know, the problem with modern pinball is that it's too big, too heavy, it sits in dark corners, it has mechanisms that break, and it's not a video game. But hey, the good thing about pinball is that it's dark, heavy, sits in corners well, has wonderful toys you can play with, and it's not a video game. Thanks for coming again this year. We always try and have a lot of fun when we do the Pat Lawler Show, and that's what this is all about, fun. You get together for 3 days and talk about your favorite hobby, or maybe your second favorite hobby, or third favorite hobby, whatever it is. And hopefully you get to meet some of the people who make the games, and find out that we're really as screwed up as you think we are. How many, I always do this at the beginning of the show before we introduce everybody, how many people are in the audience for the very first time this year? Wow, that is great. So there are all these people who have no idea what they're in for. Okay, that'll be fun. I want to start out by thanking a bevy of people very quickly. I want to thank Rob for having us back again this year. It's always a pleasure to do this. I'd like to thank all of the hardworking engineers slash management at Williams, who are, many of which are surrounding you in this room, for delving through their personal goodie collections to bring you some of the stuff that we're going to give away today. Without their willing to do this, we couldn't be willing to give you all this good stuff to take home so that you can put it in a trash compactor on your own. So this is from me to you guys. Thank you all very much for doing that. I appreciate it. And of course, I need to thank the panel of experts behind me who will enlighten you as to the inner workings of the pinball world. I need to thank one other person. We're going to be playing a game today. Today we're going to play a version of The Price is Right. And but I need to thank Steve Kordek from the bottom of my heart. Steve went to a huge amount of trouble and time to pull some of the brochures for the games that we're going to put up on overheads here, and research what they were worth back in 1936, so that we could play the game. And I need to thank Steve Kordek. Steve, thank you very much. Okay, ground rules. Ground rules are simple. In regards to questions, for the people on the panel and myself or whatever, the questions, we don't answer questions about our competition because we don't know anything about what our competition does and it wouldn't be fair. We try to not answer any questions about current projects that may or may not be being built at Williams right now. Probably talk to our competition about some of that. That's off limits. Personal questions may be off limits. For example, if you were to say to Roger, "Were you in Paris when Princess Di crashed? And why were you there?" Roger himself, if it had to do with pinball, might answer it. But if it didn't, it's a personal question and only he cares. So those are the rules. We're going to play The Price is Right today. And the way we're going to do that is pretty simple. We're going to do our normal. I'm going to get a question from the audience. You're going to ask one of your questions. Our panel of experts is going to enlighten you about pinball. At the end of that, I'd like you to remain standing. Then Roger's going to begin with pull 3 of those magic numbers that you have in your hand. You 3 people are going to be the contestants in the game. The person who asked the question gets to pick one of you that he's going to kind of hop a ride with, and if you win, he wins. Okay. And then we're gonna put up a picture of a game. We're going to tell you what year it was. The 3 people are going to name the suggested retail price of the game, and I want to be very clear about something, okay? Since in this business there usually isn't a suggested retail price of a game, it's whatever somebody can get out of you for the game, okay? What we did was we know the cost of the game as it went out of the factory, okay? But I can't just blurt that out, okay? That's something we're not allowed to do. So we took a standard markup, applied it against that, and that's what these prices are. So I don't want you rushing up to me after the show, after you've lost a prize, and go, you know, I bought one of those at my distributor, and it really cost this much. Okay, so no, you know, when we're all done and said, whatever we thought it might be is what it is, and it's because we're all here to have fun. Okay, the rules of The Price is Right, for those of you who have never seen the game show because it was like really old, but now you can see it on the game show channel over and over and over until you're sick of it, is you name the price that you think the game is sold for, okay? If you go over the price that the game sold for, Beulah the buzzer will shock you right out of the game. Okay? If you're under it, you're in the running. The person who is the closest to the suggested retail price of the game is the winner, and lovely Lewis here will give you a prize that you will, I promise, enjoy. If you have lost, if you are one of the 2 contestants who blew it, okay, you get to remain standing. We're going to pick one more number, and then you get to stand up there and we'll keep making fun of you. Okay, until when you get 2 chances, and if at the end of 2 chances, you finally get to sit down, you're a loser, and we'll get somebody else. Personally embarrassed by the Williams team, that's right.
Now, please note that this game will evolve, the rules will change as we go along, so that Pat will be demonstrating to you the exact process of designing a game. And as we know that the seminar is scheduled to end at 5 o'clock, games never get thoroughly designed on time, so I'm sure we'll be here till 7 or 8.
Bye there.
Okay, what I want to do is I want these guys to please tell you who they are, what they do at Williams, a little bit about like what games or what their background is, and then we're gonna like rock and roll here. We're gonna start this show, so we can start with Lewis, please.
I'm your prize coordinator for this evening. My name is Louis Koziars. I'm a programmer for Williams. My last 2 games were No Good Gophers and Arabian Nights.
My name's Ted Estes, and up until about a year ago, I was manager of the pinball software department. I kept the software engineers in line. Now I've moved over to the slot machine, video, casino product line. While those guys that I taught all I know to are carrying on the pinball torch. Last game I worked on with Pat was Roadshow.
My name's Larry DeMar, and in a former life I was known as the guy in the suit. So I decided to get with the program this year. I am the director of I'm the director of engineering of the Williams Pinball Group, and so being in management, that means I do nothing. I used to.
Don't let him kid you. He goes to more meetings than anyone you've ever met.
And I have the whole design group working for me, the really most talented, dedicated group of people you can imagine, creating all this fun stuff. And I really envy them because I'd love to jump in there and join them most of the time.
Roger Sharp, Director of Licensing. For those who sat through last night, you know that this is just one of the greatest things for me to do, which is to sit in front of an audience, locked in. Let's see, last two games I did, Cyclops and Sharpshooter 2. Oh, that's from a different era. Last two projects, I guess, Universal Monsters for Monster Bash, and do we dare talk about the enemy? NFL Blitz.
I sense hostility in the crowd. Okay, with that humble beginning, what we're going to do is we're going to get going here. I need to take a question from the audience, and because Roger's the most uncomfortable, make sure it's directed at him. No, I'm kidding. Sir, what's your first name? Nate. Nate. Okay, what's your question? Everyone wants to hear you.
My question was, what's the meaning of video mode in Junkyard for about 19,000?
Oh.
Well, we just happen to have a junkyard programmer designer here.
The other video mode for other games, what is the 19,000? Is that
Okay, the question is in junkyard. What is the meaning of the video mode?
Well, Night Mission isn't a video mode. Night Mission is a mode. It's a guess at a mode that's in a game upcoming in the future. It's good to talk about the future. I can't talk about the rest. Does that answer your question?
I work with him and I have no idea what he said.
You're talking about the time machine mode, right? Yeah. Time machine mode, Night Mission, right? In the time machine mode, if the year goes forward, I think to 99. I forget.
In a parallel universe.
Right. It stops there, and you're playing a mode from a game that's going to take place in the 99.
Okay, so do our games confuse you? Okay, now what we need to do is we need three numbers quickly, Roger. 3 numbers quickly.
My glasses on.
Loudly.
230-7549.
Who's that? Where? Stand up, please. Next number.
All right, next number, 230-7576.
Stand up, please. Next number.
7613.
13. Okay, sir, which one of these people would you like to hang your hat on as being able to win a prize for you? Quickly. Oh, okay. Good choice. Okay, now, Lovely Lewis will put up a game. This game is from what year, Lovely Lewis?
1934.
$10.
No.
Chris Ross. Okay. Contestant number 1, what would be your guess as to the selling price of this game in 1934? I'm sorry? $39. Okay, sir, what would be your guess for the selling price of this game in 1934?
23.
23? And sir?
48.
$48?
Yeah.
Okay, Lewis, which one of our contestants is the winner? $92.50. Okay.
It must be electrical.
Sure. Okay, so that makes you the winner, right? I think so. Okay, Louis, what do we have for this gentleman? Please choose prize 1, 2, or 3. Which one? 3? 3. He liked door number 3. He gets a t-shirt. And the unfortunate thing is, you're done.
But it was a good question.
But it was a good question and we enjoyed it. Okay, we need a question from somebody in the audience. We need... Ma'am.
Are Red and Ted married and is Rudy their kid?
That's a great question.
Since Rudy came first, was he born out of wedlock?
Rudy is related to Red and Ted, okay? They make a reference in Roadshow, okay, to... Ted makes a reference in Roadshow to Red's stupid brother Rudy on the East Coast, okay? And yes, they're related. It's Red's brother. Rudy is Red's brother. Okay. So